Hello, welcome to PlannerPod. This is the podcast of the Planner magazine. We're the member magazine and associated website of the Royal Town Planning Institute. I'm Simon Wicks, editor of the Planner. With me I have Laura Edgar, our news editor, Ben Gosling, our senior writer, and our special guest today, Robbie Calvert, the RTPI's head of policy and public affairs. In this episode, we'll be picking out our highlights from the latest issue of the Planner. We'll be speaking to Robbie about the planning and infrastructure bill that's currently going through Parliament. And Ben will be taking a closer look at issues raised by one of this month's feature articles. Let's talk about planning. We've got a new issue. It's got a great picture of the Chief Planning Inspector, Richard Schofield, on the cover, and all the usual news, opinions, features, appeal reports and updates from the Institute. Laura, what's your planner pick this issue?
So this issue, it was 1 year on from the implementation of biodiversity net gain, mandatory biodiversity net gain, and everybody seemed keen to comment. There were some rumblings that perhaps it wasn't quite going as planned, but generally, despite one person saying it wasn't the cliff edge people thought it would be, and that there were a few teething problems with the metric, it seems to be bedding in quite well, and people are, getting on with it pretty happily. It's of course it's a 30-year policy, so 1 year in, we can't really be sure how it's really doing. What
were the rumblings, Laura? Because I know there was some talk about rumours really from relating to the Labour government and their approach to BNG.
There was a freedom of information request done to local authorities by the Wildlife and Countryside Link that said that just 680 hectares of off-site land had been set aside for nature's recovery, which is a shortfall of 86% against what DEFRA were hoping for. But obviously, at 30 years of policy, I don't think we can be too strung up on that. It's got to take time to bed in. Obviously, we've only had a year's worth of planning applications.
You interviewed a number of people. We went back to people we spoke to a year or so ago when the policy was launched. Who was saying what? I mean, what sort of things were people actually saying? I mean, how optimistic did you feel they were?
I got the feeling people were optimistic and that we shouldn't get down on the policy now.
Right.
There's a long way to go, and drawing trends at this point is difficult.
Now, Robbie, I know that you're very keen on rewilding, and you were telling us earlier about how you spent time up in Scotland in rewilding projects. Now, obviously, this is an English policy, isn't it, BNG? But you represent the whole of the UK on behalf of the RTPI. What's your take on what's happening with this at the moment? Do you sort of feel there's a sense of confidence within the market that the BNG system will prevail as it is at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think just like Laura said, we're still bedding in at this stage. This is a significant policy, and I think it's fair to say for the last year, it's really engrossed a lot of the development industry in England, and it's certainly something that's being discussed in Scotland as well. So there was a bit of research done around the metric in England and whether that could be transposed into a Scottish context. And I think, the recommendation from that report was that, broadly it could. However, there has been some issues around peatland and upland in particular, and whether some kind of sort of tailored approach would be necessary in Scotland. And that's particularly when you're considering all the onshore wind sort of applications that come through in Scotland, although that will be an impending issue in England with the sort of change in policy approach to onshore wind here. And I guess when it comes to that BNG, clearly, often it's a site-by-site basis, and there's a lot in the planning and infrastructure bill. We'll come back to that around nature restoration, strategic development strategies, and how they can set out like nature recoveries in England as well and deal with nature at a more strategic level. But if you look what's happening in Scotland, we have the emerging nature networks, which I worked on in my previous role at Scottish Borders Council. And that's a really interesting approach to connecting up nature across landscapes and across authorities as well. So it's quite a dynamic area across both nations. And I think a lot of learning to be done between them as well at this stage. But I guess like an anecdote is when I worked for the Cairngorm National Park Authority and I was dealing with an unallocated site in a national park, obviously. And it was semi-improved pasture, grazing land. And it was a housing site for 10 houses. But the actual landscaping scheme, I think, brought around the planting of about 100 to 200 trees on that site. And our ecologists were actually really excited about that. because through this change in use of land, there's actually an opportunity to improve the biodiversity value of sites. And I think that's a lot of members of the public don't quite understand that point. And I think there's something on us to communicate that better, that development is not concreting over our grassy, beautiful green space, and that there's an opportunity to actually get gains for nature as well as for society through development.
Laura, given what Robbie's just said, was your impression that the people you spoke to, do you feel that they felt communication could be better around the B&G policy in order to sort of generate a bit more support for it and a bit more understanding of it?
I wouldn't say we actually discussed that. I think we should say that in Greater Cambridgeshire, they are doing their best to get the details of the policy across and the importance of the policy. I think Helen of Barrett's did say that it has changed house building for the better in the last year.
Okay, that's
interesting. And they're really keen to push that at their end.
I mean, it's good to hear a volume house builder saying that, because, a scheme like this relies on the large developers to support it. I think we need to move on. You can read Laura's excellent report, which is very detailed, in the latest issue of the Planner. Let's move on to you, Sven. What's your Planner pick?
Yeah, so I picked out the case study from the last issue, which was for the Thimphu Structure Plan 2023, which was the winner of the RTPI's International Award for Planning Excellence. Mm-hmm. So this was really interesting to research and write. So Bhutan, Thimphu is the capital of Bhutan, is one of the only carbon positive countries in the world. And Thimphu, which is the capital, largest city, is in a river valley right next to these enormous, fantastic carbon sequestering forests. So it's a plan that's very much focused on growth within existing limits rather than expansion and land conversion. And in Bhutan, as a country, they measure gross national happiness rather than GDP.
Yep.
So that's the entire sort of underpinning philosophy for their planning policy.
Yeah.
For this plan, they worked with the Doughnut Economics Lab, which Kate Rayworth and her team, which is this sort of framework that is aimed at ensuring no one wants for life's essentials in society, and while ensuring that pressure on the Earth's natural resources isn't exceeded or overshot. And that's got a real sort of synergy, I suppose, with the ideas behind gross national happiness. So I think it's always really interesting with the International Award. We had it last year with the Vancouver Broadway plan, comparing it to sort of domestic planning in the UK, if you like. I would say we're maybe slightly kind of lacking that clarity of vision that they have in Bhutan. We have a lot of goals, in terms of housing and energy, but we maybe don't have that kind of golden thread, that underpinning philosophy that ties it all together and makes sure that everything is pulling in the same direction.
I mean, what's really interesting about that, of course, is this combination of gross national happiness as opposed to GDP. And really, our system, as we know, is being driven very strongly by a thrust towards economic growth, GDP. Do you think, as a result of having sort of read through and looked at and analysed and spoken to people about the Bhutan plan, do you think we're missing a trick there?
I mean, I think in a very broad sense, possibly, it's important to kind of recognise the huge differences, Bhutan's sort of natural context is so vastly different to our own, and maybe their approach to that is very different, and I think we could learn something from that. They're a majority Buddhist country, which feeds into gross national happiness and so informs their planning policy. We don't have that, so I'd say it's not necessarily about kind of rote copying other planning approaches. It's about having that kind of focus on one single philosophy that is kind of underpinning our approach to planning.
Because when we were, and I am going to bring this up, when we were talking about this, when you were writing it, you did approach me and say, Simon, I'm a bit worried about this. Because during the course of your research, you uncovered the information that at the outset of Bhutan's launch of gross national happiness as an overriding framework for its sort of economy and its approach to politics, there may have been some persecution of minorities.
So, yeah, as I say, it's a massive majority Buddhist country. Yeah. I think there was a small but significant minority of non-Buddhists who had to leave the country in the 1970s.
Yeah.
It's worth, kind of noting that this was in the 1970s. Bhutan's only been a constitutional monarchy since 2008, I think.
Right.
So it's still very much in the infancy of that way of government. And, this plan was drafted with a lot of help from Prior and Partners, which is a firm in the UK. And, they made it very clear that kind of equality and diversity is sort of baked into this plan.
Yeah.
It's a big part of doughnut economics, and it's a big part of the plan.
My pick this month is kind of in the magazine and kind of not. It's we have a congratulations page for our Women of Influence. Those of you who follow the Planner on LinkedIn or pick up the magazine or visit our website will know that every year we invite our readers and people within the planning world to nominate their women of influence in planning. And we publish that on or around International Women's Day. We pull together a judging panel. We go through these really detailed nominations. We have an assessment process, and we produced around 50 women each year who we believe have been women of influence in and around planning. And it's absolutely brilliant. It's a lot of work for us, but it's also something we find very inspirational. And Laura and I in particular, it's sort of our joint project. So, Laura, I'm very quickly going to ask you, what are your thoughts on the list this year? What stands out for you? What struck you?
I really think it's just the amount of new names that are coming forward that we've not heard of before. It actually gives me great joy just to see the amount of new women we see on the list, and the work they're doing and the variety of work that they're doing, whether it's minerals, local planning, large-scale schemes. There's such a variety, and it's just great fun to read, really.
So, I mean, what struck me actually was that there were a number of women on the list who we can broadly describe as sort of entrepreneurial or enterprising or disruptive in some way, who are sort of breaking convention in terms of both being a woman in a man's world. So, for example, operating in areas of planning that are traditionally male, or simply setting up and starting businesses off their own back and becoming successful. And there's a particular one of our Northern Irish women on the list whose name I forget, I'm so sorry, who has launched her own firm to support development of renewable energy projects, which are a very, very male-dominated area, and she's doing absolutely brilliantly. So we're going to have a reception on May the 13th in London, where we're going to be celebrating these women. We'll have a panel discussion. It may well touch on this issue of disruptive women, and we're all looking forward to that. Robbie, what's your pick?
So I've gone for the feature article. So that's on Richard Schofield, who's the Chief Planning Inspector.
Yeah.
I really like this approach from the planner, because I guess planning is about place, but it's humans who make that place.
Yeah.
And really enjoyed the human story behind Richard and his career, the fascinating career path. I think vintage bookseller to archivist to planner, which is interesting. And I really liked the bit as well where he's acknowledging his ADHD diagnosis. And I think that's really fitting, given a lot of important discussions we're having in the industry at the moment about how we better support neurodiversity. And I believe we've just had Neurodiversity Awareness Week as well. So really interesting to get his side of things there and about how that impacts upon his work and what sort of adjustments he makes to deal with that. But I think more broadly, there was a really, really interesting point in here about that kind of delicate balancing act that I think planners, and particularly planners in the public sector, and I can see how the planning inspector would feel this way as well, about that sort of feeling that we need to always remain kind of impartial, and I guess the litigious nature of planning is sometimes sort of silences public sector planners in particular. But actually that kind of shift in the planning inspector that he's a part of in terms of becoming more sort of transparent, collaborative, and actually promoting the work we do. And that's something that really resonates with me from my public sector experience. I think often our comms were very carefully managed press releases after a planning application was approved or refused, and that would be about it. But I think we should do more as an industry to promote ourselves and our work, and that's in particular with the public sector.
I mean, he was a terrific interviewee. Ben, you actually conducted the interview. What was your overall impression of Richard, and how did you find him?
Yeah, I thought he was absolutely fantastic to talk to. Really open, which kind of reflects his ambition for the planning inspectorate. He I think he mentions at one point how he wants that to be his legacy at the planning inspectorate. And I thought it was really interesting as well how the sum of his career that obviously wasn't all in planning, it all added up to make him a better planner, to make him, a better chief planning inspector, And I think when we look at resourcing, when we look at getting people into the profession, I think we need to kind of, consider that it takes all types, it takes people from all types of sort of professional and academic backgrounds for planning.
I think he's a very, very good advert for the planning sector and for careers in planning, really. Not least because the photo shoot was absolutely amazing. Richard Lee Hare, who's one of our regular photographers, did a superb job of photographing Richard Schofield, who just absolutely looked the part in his sort of red velvet jacket. Very dramatic, very cinematic, actually. Great shot. So, pick up a copy of the planner. Have a look at the photos of Richard. Just look at the pictures. You don't need to read the words. It's just great. I think it's fair to say we've got a lot of good stuff in the magazine. Let's move on. Robbie, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Robbie, you're here ostensibly to talk about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. I'm going to kick off by making reference to something else in the planner. Each month we have a column written by someone at the RTPI under the name Hippodamus, who was a planner from the ancient world. And in this one, Hippodamus makes the case for having a statutory purpose of planning and makes the point that the RTPI has requested this as something that should be included within the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Robbie, could you talk us through that a bit? I mean, what would a statutory purpose of planning be, and what would it achieve?
So for context, at the start of the year, we were responding to a lot of government working papers that have fed into the drafting of the bill. But in the process of doing that, we thought we're being a bit reactive here. Is there any proactive asks that we have of government, things that we haven't seen in the working papers and things we want to see in the bill? And set out some legislative asks. They sit on our planning reform hub on the RTPI's website. So ask all listeners and go review that in their own time. And one of those asks is around the purpose of planning. In terms of I see the purpose of planning very much on the face of the bill and an outward-looking part of the bill. And I think it's important to frame the subsequent legislation, but also bring around that kind of collaborative notion around all those who engage with the planning system, be that planning officers, developers, communities, but also politicians as well. And anyone who tuned into the second reading debate and endured 6 hours of slight confusion over what the purpose of planning is, would maybe agree. In terms of the precedent, it's something that I was well aware of in Scotland, having been involved with the planning bill and that's passage through Parliament and something we'd got in and secured. But it was drawn to my attention more recently that Wales and Northern Ireland also have a purpose of planning too. And then this week, subsequent investigations have actually unearthed purposes of planning across the world, so in different legislative frameworks across Australia and Canada too. So we're now on the stage working with our English Policy Committee of actually getting together an amendment which we will table with specific wording, which we're trying to secure now with our Policy Committee around that, begging and borrowing elements from everything that we've seen nationally and globally as well.
Are you seeing there's a kind of a correspondence between these different statutory purposes of planning? Can you see a thread running through them and a commonality?
I think it's clearly globally and nationally it's been seen as something that's key to set out from the off. I think planning is a confusing and vast topic, and that kind of having that vision and that framing is really, really key, and it's something we've pushed government to do, especially using this opportunity of planning reform in England to bring some spotlight onto the system and any subsequent changes. And I think I find it very useful professionally, or I did working in Scotland. When someone asked me what I did for my job, I said, well, my job is to manage the use and development of land in the long-term public interest.
Yep.
So actually, I don't think it's been a lot of case law has derived from it. So it doesn't function like the rest of the legislation probably would. But very, very useful and important from that, as I say, outward-looking public relations element of it.
I mean, there's an awful lot to unpack within that, and I think it's going to be a thread through probably everything we ever talk about in relation to planning.
When you were looking at purposes of planning internationally, did they tend to be sort of contextual? Were they sort of
universal?
Universal, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, in looking at the various purposes I thought I could neatly transplant them into the English planning system, no problem at all, actually. And so they were quite universal, actually. They were all different. I think the purpose does provide that opportunity to draw down on international commitments, for example. So the Paris Agreement, commitments relating to biodiversity. And then you see, for example, the Welsh approach, which is future well-being of generations. So that could be potentially incorporated as well. But no, all run along a very similar theme and certainly transplantable, which was really interesting, actually.
I always say, whenever anybody asks me, what is planning, what's it about, I'll always answer, it's an attempt to answer the question, how do we want to live? It really is that broad. And you can view it as a regulatory system, which is sort of quite fine and technically detailed, but always at the back of it is this question, how do we want to live? And how can we use the planning system as an instrument towards achieving it? Laura, is there anything in particular that you'd like to dig out there?
Well, I was going to ask about local plans and strategic development strategies.
Oh, okay. Well, should we jump into that?
No, because there's a lot of movement recently on local plans. Local planning authorities are moving forward now. We've got the NPPF with their local plans, and we're all looking to adopt theirs next week, a meeting. And I was just wondering, I'm curious about everybody having their local plans. That's what the Labour government want them to have, but they're going to introduce strategic spatial development strategies. And what's the relationship going to be between local plans and spatial development strategies, which will be across a slightly larger boundary? And how are the resources going to be in putting all of that together?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think around the strategic development strategies, it's a kind of good opportunity with the publication of the bill to maybe sit back and really appreciate what a step forward this is. This has been a very long-term ask of the RTPI to reinstate the strategic level and our members, and we are delighted to see this coming through. Having said that, I do not imagine that the transition will be simple or easy. I don't think it was ever going to be the case, quite frankly. And I think there's definitely going to be an issue around synchronicity, timing, and the kind of project management elements. And we have lots of different moving parts, as Laura's identified. We will have a revised NPPF this summer at some point, which will set out the sort of future of local planning systems. We had the government response to the local plan consultation published recently as well, which sets out some of their thinking ahead of that. National development management policies. We have local government reform alongside the devolution bill as well. So that's a lot of ducks to line up. I think the first iteration of SDSs won't be perfect, and nor could they ever be. Different local plans will be at different stages, as Laura pointed out there. Some are getting adopted at the moment. I imagine other planning authorities have paused them. And so it will be the case that strategic development strategy will work with existing local plans in the first instance, and then in future iterations I imagine they'll be setting out some of the more sort of key strategic growth investment opportunities, and then things like strategic greenbelt review, and then pulling in different plans as well, so local growth strategies, energy plans, etc.
It's interesting that, because I was going to ask what would a strategic development strategy do? And some time ago, I was talking to Katrina Riddell, who is, somewhat the guru on this, really. And she envisaged these sort of larger than local plans as being effectively economic development plans, which set out a number of broad goals, which then filter down into the local plan itself. Is that, how is that likely to happen? And what impact might that have on local plans? Particularly those which then might not be in harmony with the strategic development plan. Will local authorities have to go back and revisit their local plans and revise them?
Potentially, and even the strategic development strategies themselves can get interim reviews too. So as and when local plans are adopted through their process, there's a review mechanism there too. I think it's easy to look back with rose-tinted glasses at previous iterations of regional or sub-regional planning. In England, for example, regional spatial strategies and some of the structure plans. Some of those plans were really, really extensive, running to 400 pages plus. So I think this time round, and learning from some of those lessons in history, the next iterations of SDSs are going to be a bit more light touch. So they're not going to be about allocating sites. That'll be for the local plans. Mm-hmm. And instead, it will just be allocating those sort of key areas of growth and strategic investment as well. So absolutely acknowledging Katrina's sort of take on the kind of economic development side of things. But as I was saying earlier as well, I think they're going to be critical in terms of how we sort of deal with nature recovery and, like I say, strategic reviews of Greenbelt, etc., etc. So very much just setting that context, which will then be delved into a little bit with the local plan.
So it'll be much more about issues that cross a boundary as opposed to the ones that are more local.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing beyond that as well, we need to think about how the strategic development strategies themselves interact. Yeah. And so that's one of our legislative asks for the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is a long-term aspect. We want to see a national spatial framework, and we think that'll be critical at knitting together these different strategic development strategies and dealing with these larger than sub-regional issues, which there is. So landscape restoration, but if you think of other issues, for example, around coastal erosion or sort of nationally significant infrastructure projects as well, we think given this new tier, actually it tees up that national picture and the need for that as well. And it's tying in a lot of the government sectoral plans, for example, the industrial strategy, and how those can be woven together and given that sort of spatial perspective, which will be really important in terms of how the strategic development strategies evolve over time as well.
So, Robbie, I'm quite keen to get your views on the sort of delegation aspect of the bill, because we may see now some applications being determined by planning officers rather than going through to committees at local authority level. Obviously, there's the RTPI has its 4 legislative asks, which includes mandatory broadcasting of committees and potentially chief planning officers at local authorities. So, I was hoping to get your views on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the schemes of delegation, in our engagement with the membership, there is general support for this. I know this was one of the more controversial elements of the bill on Monday's debate, and that's understandable as well. We do think that decision makers should be chartered, or at least working towards chartership. I know I would say that because I work for the RTPI, but I think that's a critical part of ensuring that kind of robust decision making.
Well, they're bound by contract, aren't they?
Exactly. And in a similar note, I think the chief planning officer is a critical part of the planning committee, but also any future scheme of delegation as well. And we think by making that a statutory position, that will protect not only the way that planning committees function, but also the structure by which planning departments exist. And so we've seen over the last couple of years, a lot of planning departments split up and moved into other parts of the local authority. And actually, we want to see them pulled back together again. We see the chief planning officer as a key element of that. In terms of going forward, there will be a consultation around the schemes of delegation. So at this stage, we don't have all the details, and we will engage with that in due course. But around our legislative ask about broadcasting to the public, I think 15% of planning committees are not currently broadcast. I think that's a small enough number to actually enhance our point around it, because clearly 85% of planning authorities see the value of it. And we think that needs to move up to 100. If smaller amount of more significant planning applications are going to committee, we need to do a better job about engaging the public with those critical decisions for their area.
So there's a really interesting point here around accountability and visibility of decision making, and basically the function of local democracy and why we vote and who we vote for. And it's very easy for the public to look at decisions made by, quotes, unelected bureaucrats and say this is unfair. So how would any scheme of delegation or system of delegation overcome or circumvent that? How would you answer that criticism from the public?
Well, I think when you look at the system as a whole, we need to see what's the most effective use of our community engagement. And I see that in the local plan preparation process, and actually getting communities behind the preparation of a strategy that sets out how their area will change over time and gets them involved. So less at the kind of reactive, sharp end of simply objecting to planning applications, but actually more that co-production of their area and over time how it will manifest. So I think if there is a kind of reduced element of planning committees here, we need to do more about involving communities earlier in the planning application stage. And even with strategic development strategies, we're doing a bit of research with Demos at the moment, which we'll publish soon, about how we can engage communities at those kind of sub-regional levels. But I think we can do more about engaging communities, about actually setting out that strategy and sort of changing the conversation a little bit to being a bit more proactive and optimistic, I think, as opposed to the kind of reactive, objectionary nature of our current system.
I mean, I spoke to Richard Schofield about this during the interview, and he said he didn't anticipate a sea change in the amount of appeals that the planning inspectorate is going to have to deal with as a result of this. I think what would be really interesting is, the planning inspectorate publishes its appeals data. I think once these changes have gone through, if they go through, keep an eye on that, see how many appeals are coming through. Is it going up? Is it going down?
And I would say the nature of the appeals as well, probably, and the reasons for them. And are they appeals against officer decisions or committee decisions? That's going to be a really critical point. Because one of the criticisms of the current system is that you have elected members who may not be as well educated in the planning system as we might want them to be, or may have other tensions, other pressures on them, which influence their decision-making. So, for example, the risk of losing their seat if they say something that they know their constituents aren't going to agree with. And that can often lead to applications which meet all the criteria being turned down for political reasons. And then you go through an appeal process, which is very costly, and very often it will go against the council. So, Ben, do you think that's, or both of you, all of you, do you think this is something that might be reduced by having this kind of clarity within the system?
I mean, I think it could potentially cut both ways. You have your application determined by a planning officer. You can either say, right, it's been determined by, quote unquote, an unelected bureaucrat, or you can say, look, it's been determined by someone who is incredibly well placed to determine it, and I'm going to abide by that decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the proposals as well, and you looked at the working paper around planning committees, the government was certainly proposing things as a package, to just pick up on your point around elected member training. So now we've seen provisions for that to be mandatory, which we absolutely support. In fact, we think they should go a bit further. We believe there should be a test. And we also think they should be refreshed, and that
sort of theory test and a practical.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And we think they should be refreshed, and that should be triggered by any kind of nationally significant planning reform, for example, or the adoption of a strategic and local plan. And I know this occurs in a number of authorities anyway, but we think there's no harm about sort of mandating that. And back to my point, if it is in the local plan, well, it has had political scrutiny up to that stage, and maybe we need to just do better about preparing local plans and involving elected members and communities in that part of the process, and then allow the planners to take more delegated responsibilities around the actual determination of applications.
On that, I know that one of the other RTPI asks, or one of the other issues that's important to the RTPI, is around statutory consultees in plan making. Can you just talk us through the RTPI's position on that, please, Rob?
Yeah, so there was a government announcement on statutory consultees that sort of followed the publication of the bill as well, so clearly something that they're looking at too. I think when we look at the performance of a planning system, and we look at, for example, MHCLG's skills and capacity survey that was published in January, we were very much looking at just purely the planning department and the planning officers and capacity and skills there. But the performance of the system as a whole relies on a number of other players, including internal specialists, but statutory consultees as well. Not only through the development management process, but also a key part of the local plan preparation process as well. So one of our asks around the bill was a more general one around resourcing, which we can come back to. But it's touched on your point that you made around appeals as well. If we are making decisions around statutory consultees, they need to be evidenced. And that's why we asked for a whole planning system audit so we could understand how consenting teams in statutory consultees, how their resources has changed over time. And we think that kind of information is really, really critical when we think about making interventions, be it financial or policy related ones too. Our first instinct is we need to understand the lay of the land a little bit and then make some interventions accordingly.
Well, see, I mean, To sort of pick up on both the point about statutory consultees and slightly earlier about delegated decisions, we've heard a lot about the resourcing issues in local authorities. Are these changes going to exacerbate those if we're asking planning officers to take on increased workloads with delegations?
Well, I mean, taking planning applications to planning committees is in itself a resource burden for planners. So I don't see that one as adding significant resource. Clearly, strategic development strategies will require resource to prepare them. Where are those planners coming from? Are we going to be dealing with secondments out of local plans teams? Potentially, there's a finite pool of planners, and we may be fishing in that same pool. There'll be resource considerations for PINs as well when they're dealing with like a flood of new examinations to come alongside their general day-to-day appeal work around development management as well. So yes, definitely some resourcing things to consider there. It was one of our sort of asks ahead of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, a sort of principle that we'd set out, that we didn't want to see new and unfunded duties coming through in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And that's recognising the existing resource constraints of the planning system. And I know government have gone on record with the 300 additional new planners to come through, and something we warmly welcome. However, I think most people don't think that's going to really even scratch the surface. It's less than one planner per authority.
Yeah.
And the Homes Builders Federation Planning on Empty report, I think, identified an existing need of 2,200 up to 7,500 potential need to deliver on the government's growth ambitions, which will require a huge amount of additional consents coming online as well. No, I don't see the Planning and Infrastructure Bill as a huge resource burden in itself, and we welcome that, but I don't think it will fix and address the existing resourcing issues that we have, and that's impact on performance. I think you can reform the planning system till you're blue in the face, but unless you resource it effectively, it will not deliver the outcomes that you intend.
Laura, was there anything you wanted to ask? Anything additional?
I suppose the only thing with the resourcing is you've spoken about the RTPI keen for the apprenticeship levy to retain the planners, and that's going to be key.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in particular with the apprenticeship scheme, it enables authorities to maybe more quickly bring that resource online instead of your kind of undergraduate or postgraduate course approach. So you have instant kind of resource, and then those planners will be let out on day release, and they can take away maybe some of the less significant work away from your senior or your principal planners, who you can really focus on the major schemes. I mean, we acknowledge there may need to be reform to the apprenticeship scheme, but we need confidence and transition arrangements in place to ensure that we do not turn the tap off on this pipeline of planners. Yeah. And it is critical that we understand the issues around workforce alongside resourcing, because if you just flood resourcing into the planning system, but you don't have the actual manpower, it will, again, not deliver on your intended outcomes. So it's great to see, for example, the provision in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill about planning fee increase and how that increase needs captured and reinvested into the planning service, which we entirely agree. But we also need to continue to ensure that we have that pipeline of planners as well. And I think that goes beyond what a lot of planning authorities are able to do. But yeah, certainly keen to see the apprenticeship continue. And I think it's really important as well, in particular for rural authorities, to be able to grow their own planners, especially ones that are far away from planning schools and struggle to attract talent into their areas.
Overall then, from an RTPI point of view, Planning and Infrastructure Bill, hit or miss?
Oh gosh, put me on the spot here. I think it goes some of the way, and I think, as I say, to recognise the importance of bringing back the strategic planning element in particular, and we're delighted to see the reinvestment of fees in particular. I would note that there's cross-national issues here as well, so elements around electricity infrastructure consenting in Scotland, for example. I think it is obviously high level. It's about provisions. More detail will come out in due course. And I think the government's issue around synchronicity and timing around all the other planning reforms is going to be absolutely critical. So I'll hold my judgment at this stage, and we'll wait and see as the year unfolds.
Brilliant. I can't imagine many people have a greater knowledge of the bill and its progress than you do, given that you spent 6 hours watching the second reading the other day. Thank you very, very much for that, Robbie. Stick with us. We're going to move on, but stick around because we will definitely be asking you about the next thing as well. Ben, it's back to you. You're going to be talking about one of the features that we featured in the latest issue of the magazine on loneliness and the built environment. So take us through it. Take it away.
Yeah. So this was a really great feature. So this was written by a consultant editor, Hugh Morris. And Hugh's identified a loneliness epidemic in the UK. So he starts the article off with a story about a man called Brian Elliott. He lost his wife and he was living in a South London estate with very few green spaces and no real sense of community. And he suffered from real sort of social isolation. And when he died, there were only 3 people at his funeral. And so the numbers on this, on loneliness, are pretty alarming. So nearly 6 in 10 adults feel lonely at least some of the time, which equates to 32 million people. Over half of people say society is too individualistic. So it's a really affecting story. And Hugh's article does a really great job of highlighting how this is very much a problem for planners. We've spoken a lot about the purpose of planning today with Robbie, and we've heard a lot from government about, 1.5 million homes target for this parliament. So what I would sort of ask is, how are we going to deliver at that scale while making sure that issues like loneliness don't slip further down the agenda? And this is something that is being sort of built into some policy. So Brent Council in northwest London has a supplementary planning document that is trying to address this. But Hugh's article really sort of identifies a need to have policies which directly address these issues of isolation and well-being.
Thank you. Laura, I know that you raised a Transport for the North report. Could you just give us a bit more detail about that and how that relates to this issue?
Yeah, so they did a survey in 2023. I don't think it was their first survey, looking at transport-related social inclusion. And we know that public transport has dropped off. Trying to get a bus can be difficult if you live outside of a city. I think this all contributes to people not being able to get around their social mobility. And if you can't get around, you can't get out to meet people, then maybe your health declines, your social interactions aren't there, and it all contributes to these feelings of loneliness. If you're isolated in your own home.
And we seem to have several tiers of this, don't we? Because we've got communities being built away from facilities, resources, and not having very good connections between them. We have communities in which there's not much space and not much opportunity for people to interact. Interestingly, this relates in a way to one of the other features in the magazine this month, which is about retirement communities and around providing communal, supportive living experiences for older people, which again, there's a loneliness aspect there as well. And we know also that there's a growing body of research and of work and of investigation and of conversation around this issue of the relationship between the built environment and mental health. And I could sort of cite you any number of organizations like Trude or Centric Lab, planners like Michael Chang who are investigating this, or one of our own writers, Katie Malkowski, who's written very, very effectively about this. Robbie, what's your general take on this? Is this something that sort of has entered the sphere of influence or the sphere of consciousness of the RTPI? Is this something that you've come across within your work within the Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done a number of practice advice notes in this region. So just acknowledging the point about aging better. And it always sort of shocks me, the fact that we are living longer, but we're not living better necessarily.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And some of the particular needs around that. So we have practice advice notes on dementia-friendly planning, for example. But on the flip side as well, we've published practice advice notes on children and young people and involving them with planning too. And I think it's going to take that kind of approach where we actually deal with all society and how we integrate all the components together. So yeah, I think it's certainly there. Impending review of the design guidance in England, maybe an opportunity to better integrate some of these ideas around inclusive design. But I think planning also maybe has a role to play in identifying these kind of key community assets and how we can better use them. As someone who's recently moved to London, I'm very, very impressed by the Hackney Wick community sauna in particular. And not just because it's an excellent sauna, but because the actual building itself also contains a tool library, an excellent cafe, and studio space as well. And I think me coming to London with my sort of regional hat on, thinking actually this would work everywhere in this country. And I think we need to be a bit more ambitious with how we set about identifying, creating these spaces beyond just your sort of regular kind of traditional pub meet-up spot as well.
And of course, pubs are closing very, very rapidly. So many communities are losing that opportunity, losing that facility as well.
And we have a change in consumer in those regards as well. I think the younger generation are drinking less, and we need to accommodate and change the product that we provide for communities to create those natural meeting spaces.
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of say, you know, we are changing in our consumption habits. There possibly isn't the demand for pubs that there once was. You know, there's the asset of community value designation. You know, I think you see this a lot in appeals with, for example, pubs being converted into housing and there being no demand for the pub being demonstrated, and so the appeal going ahead. I think it just needs to be demonstrated that, in fact, there is no need for any type of sort of communal or community facility at all, you know, whether that's a cafe, you know, a music venue.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that. I think we also need to do more about how we can bring a lot of these places into community ownership too. And there's something in the air when you do go to a community-owned asset like that. But it's something wonderful, and like maybe it's the lack of commercialization around it too, and the kind of heartfelt nature of it. But the more we can do as a planning system to encourage policies that help communities to take these assets on themselves and develop into what's suitable for their communities in particular, the better.
Laura?
I think it probably also comes down to not isolating policies and isolating departments in local authorities. We've got the planning department, you've got highways department, and do they talk to each other to ensure that everything's joined up, that we know what we really need and how we can facilitate people's mobility, especially with the lack of buses that we've got now. I've got the opposite problem to you, Robbie. I've moved out of London. I've moved to a village that doesn't have a bus service unless you just want to go to the town once a week for 2 hours and then come home again. So I think we need to be talking across departments in order to iron out some of these issues so that people can get about and don't rely on the car, which is, of course, something the RTPI has also looked at.
We're kind of coming back to two things we've already talked about here. One is spatial development strategies, which one would assume should be able to provide some joined up thinking. And of course, the purpose of planning itself, which is ultimately a human purpose. One thing that really struck me with this article and with the retirement communities article is they both begin with a personal story. They really locate the impact of the built environment, the impact of space, the impact of placemaking in people's lives, and deep in their lives, and relate to the effect that living in a particular way or a particular place has on your mental health and your general sense of well-being. So purpose of planning, Robbie.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely take that point. I agree. I think planning's beyond just great placemaking or creating great places, but it's actually about creating places where people can flourish. And I think that is the ultimate goal of a planning system working well.
I think that is probably a very good note to end on. Beautifully put. This has been our first ever podcast, the first ever PlannerPod. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for listening. I'd like to thank our guest, Robbie Calvert at the RTPI, who's given us some great insights on the planning and infrastructure bill, but also where the RTPI sits on a number of different planning issues. To my colleagues, Laura Edgar and Ben Gosling. We're going to be cracking on now with the next issue of the Planner. We've got a few other things lined up as well. We've got our Women of Influence reception coming up. We're going to be at UK Reef in a few weeks' time. We're going to be publishing the results of our recent careers survey, so look out for those in the next issue of the magazine and on the website. And we're going to be recording another podcast, if you like this one, sometime in late May, early June. So thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.